With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our Executive Director, Mr. Tim Nowak. Tim has led the World Trade Center since 2007, and prior to his current role, he worked in international markets in Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, and South America. He's a proud Mizzou grad and a 2014 Eisenhower Fellow. And in a sure sign that 2020 really is one of the strangest years, he has actually witnessed pigs fly. So I'll let him explain what he means by that. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you. Well, hopefully, I'm glad you brought that up. Back last month, working with Lambert, St. Louis International Airport, and a number of partners, some of whom are on in our audience today, we were able to send our first shipment of live animals, breeding animals, and these were breeding pigs, a shipment to Brazil. So it is an exciting opportunity, a whole new business that Lambert St. Louis International Airport is entering into in this live animal exporting. And we look forward to really building on that with future exports to Asia and throughout the world. So it's exciting times. But I have to say, Stella, I was led to believe there would be no seafood related questions during this trivia. So I'm a little disappointed. I don't think I passed your exam on this one, but maybe the next time. Today, we are thrilled to have a longtime friend and partner of the World Trade Center St. Louis, Mr. David Forgue. David is a partner at Barnes Richardson Global Trade Law. His practice is focused on the representation of importers and exporters facing issues of compliance with US law. These issues include classification and valuation of imported merchandise, country of origin marking, investigations, audits, and penalty proceedings, along with minimizing the impact of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. He has significant experience advising across a range of industries and companies, from small in size all the way up to multinationals. David was born and raised in Chicago. He attended the University of Illinois College of Law, graduating magna cum laude. He is a frequent speaker on international trade topics and has presented at a number of international trade conferences. I should also note that he is the author and instructor of the Customs Classification and Valuation module for our long-standing Chancellor's Certificate in International Trade, in partnership with the University of Missouri, St. Louis. There may or may not be a rumor, David, on the street that this is the most difficult of the 6 modules to complete to get the certificate. So maybe you want to dial it back a little bit, or maybe it's good that you all have joined us today, because now you can get a little insight before you take the certificate yourself, and you'll find this course maybe a little bit easier. But anyway, David, thanks for being with us, and I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thank you, Tim. I should have you read every bio I ever have read, because that's the best version of my bio right there. And that module may be the most difficult, but as we say when it snows up here, it makes you strong. So we're going to talk about reshoring, factor fib, and there's a lot of topic here, right? And 2020 has been a strange year for these sorts of things. So part of what we're going to talk about is what I see, the questions that are coming across my desk and some of the reactions that we've seen to all of this. This obviously is not the full range of what's happening in the universe, but we represent a pretty broad cross-section of companies across the country, companies based in Asia, in Europe, a few enormous companies, a few small companies, mid-size, lots and lots and lots of mid-sized companies, to be honest with you. But so this is sort of what we see happening. So we can go to the next slide if you want. I have to reiterate that none of this is legal advice, right? I don't represent you. We'll deal with it. If your question bleeds into the area where I think I'm giving legal advice, I'll just tell you. I won't give you legal advice. I'll answer it to the extent I can, so don't worry about that. Ask questions as they arise. This isn't scripted. So if there's something I say that strikes you as something that you'd like to be expounded upon or clarified or anything else, the very best moment to catch it is going to be when I say it or soon thereafter. So don't worry about derailing things or anything like that. It'll be fine. And we are going to end on time. I'm sort of notorious for ending on time, whatever it takes. I always joke that, you know, when you're on a flight, you take off 45 minutes late and somehow arrive on time, and you think, why don't we just make that the schedule? We're always going to land on time. So if there's anything we don't get to, my email is in this presentation. Feel free to email me. It's no problem. Next slide, please. So when I was approached to talk about this, they talked about reshoring. And I said, well, I don't know about an hour of reshoring, because I think an hour of reshoring is mostly people hoping, but not so much what we see happening. And that's in reaction to a lot of things. It's not just the pandemic, although the pandemic matters. And it's not just some of the trade policy that the Trump administration implemented, right? Some of this was already in process before. So really, we're going to talk about three things. Reshoring is moving things back to the US from abroad. So you moved your plant to China, you realized you didn't want your plant in China anymore, you moved it back. That's reshoring. Nearshoring is you realized that it was, you know, getting all the way across the Pacific adds too much time, or too many time zones, makes communication difficult, for instance. So you move things to Mexico. Mexico's by far the most frequent. Canada would be probably next, Central America. I've actually seen the Dominican Republic lately, which is interesting. And then diversifying has a lot of different names, but this is, we are just making sure we don't have all of our eggs in one basket country-wise. And this, to me, is by far the most common thing we're dealing with, is diversification. So next slide. So reshoring, I mean, it really, really depends on the product, right? I would say, at the risk of insulting all the business people, there are a certain percentage of businesses that make decisions, as near as I can tell, because their peers have made that decision. And during the great stampede to move manufacturing to China, some of that was done, right? We saw things move to China that I never understood how it was going to work, just because of the nature of the good, right? It really didn't make sense to me that you would move it to China, because if it was, even if it were cheaper, you still had all the built-in logistics, you had all the administrative hassles of international trade, and you built an extra month onto all of your timeframes. So it was hard to see the net benefit. And I think for some of those products, that net benefit just never happened. And so people have brought things back. What we are seeing the most of is, it makes sense to bring things back if you are in an environment that has either a lot of supplier managed inventory or just-in-time requirements, and you just need to be close to who you're supplying, right? It's not okay to have stuff on the water, or to have something, you know, moving across Canada on the train. So, you know, for many people, sort of the quickest way to get things from Asia to the US is land up north in Vancouver, move it by train to Portal, North Dakota, or Sweetgrass, Montana, one of those places, drop down to Chicago, and then distribute from there. If that all takes too long, you got to move closer. One of the hurdles that people have been facing, though, as they tried to reshore things, is they still have all these inputs that they need to have go in. They still have all these inputs, and to the extent that those are steel and aluminum, they're facing these 25% duties or 10% duties, depends on the product, that are really raising the cost of producing in the US. So if they make the finished product outside the US, it may or may not be subject to those duties. If they import the raw materials to make the product in the US, the raw material prices are elevated. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time, because I don't know that all of these duties are going to survive a change in administration. I probably don't expect them to survive as they're applied to allies. So places like Germany, I would be surprised if Germany was still facing 25% duties on steel imports. China, I think, is gonna, right? I don't know that. I don't have any special, I'm not tapped to be the Secretary of Commerce as far as I know. But this has been an impediment. And it's usually not ever labor intensive products, right? I mean, the thing the US does well is not throwing 1,000 bodies at something. It's the technology piece. So for everyone who's involved in sort of the policy end of this, what I see at reshored factories is there's a lot of technology and a few people. So I think about some I've been to where, there's an office that'll have 20 engineers in front, and there are 10 people actually working the machines in back, and they each have responsibility for two or three machines, and they're kind of just babysitting the machines, right? They're not pulling a lever or anything else. They're mostly making sure everything is still working. I think about the old joke about the factory that works completely automated. There's a man and a dog in it, and the man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to bite the man if he tries to mess with the machine. So I don't think these are big, this is a big employment category for a lot of companies. There may be some, but I think for the most part, this is about production and not necessarily employment. There's secondary employment, to be sure, right? They're truck drivers and everything else that is supportive of manufacturing, but not a huge number of manufacturing jobs. Next slide. So the truth is we haven't really seen that much reshoring. What we've seen has been sort of in the Great Lakes Basin. So Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Michigan, obviously. And it's mostly automotive. And we'll talk a little bit when we get to nearshoring about some of the pressure on automotive to be North American now. But it's mostly been automotive. And partly that is an industry that's very heavily invested in supplier managed inventory and just in time. And I will say, in case anyone isn't familiar with those terms, just in time is you supply relatively small amounts of your product to the company that buys from you, maybe a week or 2 weeks of their use, because they don't want to carry the inventory. They don't want to store the inventory. They don't want to do any of that. If they need, 2 weeks worth of crankshafts, that's all they want on site. And they're going to use that. And then it's your responsibility to get it to them. A little variant of that is supplier managed inventory, in which often, typically, your product is in their factory or in their facility, but you continue to own it. You sell it to them on consignment. And basically, when they pull it off the shelf to use it is when a sale occurs. So you still carry it on your books. You need to insure it, et cetera, et cetera. That helps drive local manufacturing, because having your supply chain go halfway around the world and still maintain that level of reasonable supply is difficult, frankly. For PPE and some, similar articles that really had left the US, I would say our experience has been that they left because they weren't economical to make in the US. And unless they become economical, the pandemic's going to pass at some point. And people don't want to have invested a huge amount of money in making rubber gloves here or surgical masks or whatever if as soon as this is over, everyone goes back to the low cost alternative and there's no benefit to having produced it in the US. So unless there's some sort of intervention, incentive, or something else, I'd be a little surprised if these things moved back to the US. I mean, obviously you can incentivize anything. So they could do, there are a number of different ways that could happen, but we have not seen a wave of that. What we've seen is people trying to figure out how to avoid higher duties on these things, people trying to figure out how to get them into the US more quickly, but not really investing in making them here on a long-term basis. The next slide, please. Does anyone have any questions about reshoring? Have I gone so quickly that everyone's trying to figure out what I'm talking about? Well, here we go. Nearshoring is, as I said, bringing things closer. Wait a minute, I just saw the Q&A light up. So far, so good. That's not a very good question. But I appreciate the sentiment, thank you. Nearshoring overwhelmingly is Mexico. I mean, if we're honest, for a lot of people, when they say nearshoring, they mean moving production to Mexico. And the USMCA, which is the NAFTA replacement, is really driving this because it has some really, really, really high requirements for labor content or for content in automotive. And I would say the changes to NAFTA that USMCA represent had almost everything to do with the automotive and associated industries. There were very few changes to other industries and enormous changes for automotive. And that makes a certain amount of sense, right? If you think about the amount of steel, rubber, glass, plastic, textile, I mean, an automotive industry that produces a lot of cars in your country means you have a lot of industry in your country. So that was really the point. A lot of the other provisions are basically the same. And I have a lot of clients for whom USMCA changed the administration of how they do their NAFTA claims, but not any analysis at all. And then I have automotive clients who I spend days and days and days and gray hairs and headaches working out what the steel requirement is in their product and how it feeds into the overall automotive requirement and et cetera. So that's driven a lot of production from China in specific to Mexico in specific. Because if that stuff is all made in Mexico, you get the same benefits as if it's made in the US. I will say as sort of a forward-looking issue, if you are invested in Mexico, you know, part of what USMCA has done is imposed a floor requirement for certain high wage parts to be made in high wage factories. And that's defined differently in Canada, the US, and Mexico. But it is sort of a floor for Mexican wages. And it is intended to not let any of the countries have a race to the bottom in terms of compensation and sort of therefore gut the other countries. And my suspicion is that's going to pull wages up across Mexico because for all these manufacturing facilities, which are much more labor intensive than they would be if they were built in the US, and it's part of the reason they're in Mexico, you know, that's a better job. If the job across the street is not automotive and pays $3 less an hour, they're going to have a lot of trouble getting people as long as the automotive is hiring. So I suspect this is going to pull labor wages up throughout Mexico over time. I will also say it is enormously confusing. NAFTA was NAFTA in every country except French-speaking Canada, right? They called it, even in Spanish, NAFTA doesn't really make sense as an acronym, but generally in our dealings with Mexico, they all use NAFTA. USMCA, everybody uses their own version. So the Canadians, it's CAUSM. Mexico, it's MUSCA, I think. Any combination of the USMCA letters is all the same thing. I don't even know what they do in French. I just know it's awkward corresponding with Canadians because I can never remember what their acronym is. And of course, you want to be sensitive to not being sort of too American, right? Because Canada's a different country and they're aware of that and they let you know that sometimes. But messing up the acronym is almost worse. So trust me on this. Don't do it if you can help it. Can we go to the next slide, Stella? All right, I have a couple of questions here. The first is, could you comment on FTZs and reshoring? The thing about FTZs is their status with the USMCA is confused at the moment. So USMCA is not helping on the FTZ front. There's supposed to be a technical fix that'll clarify how USMCA and FTZs work together instead of working at loggerheads to each other. FTZ is a foreign trade zone. And a foreign trade zone is a facility where you can bring articles in, international articles in, and they're not deemed to have yet entered the foreign commerce of the United States. And there's a lot of regulation. In the best case for a lot of people, it lets them bring a bunch of articles into the US that have a higher tariff number, higher tariff rate. So if you imported all of the pieces, you would pay 5% duties. If you manufacture an FTZ and what comes out the far end has a 2% duty, if everything works correctly and you've entered everything correctly, you pay the 2% duty and not all the 5%. So you get all the benefits of the manufacturing in the US, you've imported the articles you need, and you save on duties. And sometimes you even go to duty free. So I would say though, for a lot of the things that FTZs could be really helpful for, you're not actually allowed to get that benefit. So I don't want to get into painful detail because FTZs are all about painful detail. But suffice it to say, if you have things that are subject to anti-dumping, for instance, and so they have a really high rate on them, you actually can't get any tariff benefit in an FTZ. It's contrary to how the law requires you to enter things. So I don't know. The FTZ program has been around since World War I, and I don't know that it is going to drive reshoring per se. I think it's very useful. FTZs are very useful, but I don't know that they're newly useful, if that makes sense. Did I see that the World Trade Center wants to answer this question as well? Guess not. And the other question we have here is there a set percent increase that we think or know that US consumers will pay for goods brought back to the US to be made, or if made in Mexico, will there be an upcharge to the US consumer? So for the vast majority of things that are imported, these are inputs. These aren't finished products. Consumer products are still overwhelmingly coming from Asia. And consumer products overwhelmingly are what we're going to talk about soon, which is when we talk about diversification and sort of chasing the lowest price, that tends to be more the consumer product oriented stuff. The manufacturing, generally, I would not expect much of an upcharge because companies, there's not a non-economic reason that companies are doing this, right? You're not going to pay sort of a patriotic surcharge because a company said, well, we're just going to do this because we're Americans and Americans ought to build American things. That's also a thing some companies do, but I don't think that's part of this movement. So I wouldn't really expect things to get a lot more expensive. I guess In the short term, automobiles will, but I can tell you right now, we represent automotive OEMs, which is the car companies, right? The brand on the front. And we represent tier 1 suppliers and tier 2 suppliers, which is 2 levels of the supply to them. And nobody is contemplating increasing prices for anything, no matter what. That industry doesn't really work that way. It's more of a pounding on the head to not do that as long as possible. So I don't know that we're going to see prices go up because of this, particularly in light of, at the moment, there's 25% duties on anything steel from China. There's 25% duties on something on the order of 75% of the imports from China right now. As compared to those, you're certainly not going to see price increases. So those were the questions we had on that. For nearshoring, when we talk about how much we've seen, we have seen a lot in Mexico for automotive. As it started to become clear what the parameters of USMCA were going to be, we saw a lot of companies working to increase their ability to manufacture in Mexico. And it becomes a really big issue for some automotive elements. You're looking at having to have 70% of your input, of your value, be regional, be North American. 70% is a really high number in a car. And there are a few things that can completely mess that up. If your engine is not North American, you're very unlikely to get North American treatment. In an electric car, we are absolutely seeing battery production ramped up as quickly as humanly possible, because it's very, very, very difficult to get the NAFTA benefit if you have a motor vehicle or electric vehicle and the battery is not North American. And, at this point, there's very little automotive battery production in the US. Companies are working very hard and spending billions of dollars to change that. So that's going to be in the US and Mexico and maybe even Canada. I'm not positive about Canada. We've also seen some assembly operations moving to the Dominican and Central America. And the driving thing for nearshoring is this combination of, you have lower wages, but you also have free trade agreements between the US and the Dominican Republic and Central America all together are in one free trade agreement. Mexico is obviously in USMCA. Canada is in USMCA. You have these things with a free trade agreement that goes from basically, or actually a series of intersecting free trade agreements that go from basically the Arctic down to the tip of South America, or the top of South America. I guess the tip's the other end. All of that is sort of where people are looking for nearshoring. But the reality is Mexico has the most infrastructure with the US. They have the most sort of familiarity with business processes and billing processes and all of those sorts of things. So really this has been very significant in Mexico, and it has mostly been things coming from China. So that has been a net change. We really haven't seen people leave the US for Mexico. If they didn't do that back when NAFTA was implemented, mostly they haven't done that since. But things coming back from China to Mexico, we see a lot. Next slide, please. So supply chain diversity is really what I spend an enormous amount of time on. And that is people recognizing that the US relationship with China has changed. And it's changed in some fundamental ways, but China has also changed, right? It's not as easy to get cheap labor. It's not as easy to do anything, right? I've had some clients tell me to get to the sort of labor rates that they used to go to China for, they have to go so far into the country that there's almost no benefit to it because it's counteracted by having to move halfway across the continent to move their product. So anywhere along the coast isn't necessarily going to be for cheap labor rates. It might be for expertise. It might be for ease of supply. There are a lot of reasons that people are still there, but there are also reasons that people aren't. And they aren't only because the US has imposed all kinds of tariffs. I will say, if I had to guess, I do have to guess, a Biden administration, I think, is unlikely to take 301 duties off of Chinese products. They may try to focus them more than they are. Right now, it's roughly 75% of what comes from China by value has a 25% duty on it. They may try to focus that in some ways to make it less painful for Americans when there's not that much benefit to it. But I don't think that they just walk away from the confrontation with China. I think that once that was done, it's going to be hard for anyone to ever do again. And, some of the things that were complained of are long-standing issues. Right? The failure to protect IP, those sorts of things, those are not new issues. Those aren't things that no one ever brought up before. Those are sort of well-known long-term issues that people just sort of dealt with. So I think that the cost in China is going to stay elevated for the foreseeable. And I think the politics have become a little different, and depending on sort of what people's risk assessment is, they've been happier to be more diversified. So we see a lot of Vietnam. In fact, I would almost say Vietnam is the old school diversification. That's where everybody who was into this 3, 4, 5 years ago was going. We're getting to the point now where the US is starting to backlash in Vietnam. And so I have clients who had diversified from China to Vietnam who are now leaving Vietnam because from their perspective, they're right on the front edge of having to deal with all the big issues that they had to deal with China and Vietnam, and they just don't want to. We'll talk about those in a second. Indonesia has become a pretty common place that people are trying to get to. Lots of workforce, some issues with infrastructure and natural disasters and things that are difficult. The Philippines has become much more common. I've seen a lot more Philippines in the last year. Probably the last year, a lot more people are looking at the Philippines, particularly the sort of Subic Bay area that is a big production zone. So, but this is true throughout Asia. So we're seeing Malaysia, but Malaysia's not really cheap in any sense. Taiwan, but also not cheap. South Korea is not cheap at all. But if you want to diversify, it's another one of the places people look. The difference is how the facilities are set up. So what we're seeing a lot in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and Thailand, actually, we're seeing a lot of Thailand, is overseas Chinese communities have connections to the Chinese producers who were the suppliers in the past. And so they're helping set up factories. There's some cross-pollination of funding, maybe of ownership. And it's as seamless as it could be to move your production from this Chinese facility to this Indonesian facility, because a lot of the people who are in charge of the facility in China that you were buying from are also in charge of the facility in Indonesia, and they're sort of controlling the people running it. So what we really see is any place that has a large overseas Chinese community is sort of in the game for this diversification. What we don't see very commonly is companies sort of buying a facility and building it themselves, and American companies reaching out and sort of hardwiring themselves into these places. And I kind of suspect once you've decided you're going to keep chasing lower risk, lower labor, it's way harder to get rid of your own factory, right? Your supplier can do whatever they want, but when you move, you don't have all of the legacy costs. You don't have the tooling, you don't have the facility, you don't have the property, you don't have any of that. And the employees. So we're not really seeing that kind of investment. We're seeing more cooperative vendor shifts. A couple of things that are important about this is it doesn't necessarily solve the issue of over-reliance on the Chinese market, because often we see almost all the inputs come from China, go to the Philippines or Indonesia or Vietnam, be assembled into a product and be shipped. And that, of course, means you really haven't solved your fundamental problem. Question is, how about India? I see a lot of people talk about India. I don't really see people do India. And I have some suspicions about why that is. India is just really far from everything, right? So I remember going to a presentation one time and having someone pitching India explain that the great thing about India is you could go to New York or LA. It's really up to you in terms of shipping, which I thought was a great way to sort of make the best you could out of being really, really far from the US markets. I think India also is sort of notorious for its level of bureaucracy and not being a place where you can sort of quickly get things done. And I think one of the realities of the Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines sort of group of countries is with the existing relationships that a lot of the Chinese companies have and the overseas Chinese communities in those places, there's an ability to get through bureaucracy, I'll leave it at that, that is hard to beat. And I don't know that a lot of other places have that. Question is, with Hong Kong moving towards mainland China rule, do you think investment there will suffer or will current functions diminish? I would say that we don't see anyone new talking about how they're going to utilize Hong Kong. There are people who already have different functions that were in Hong Kong that perhaps haven't changed those. Hong Kong really does not come up in any conversations we have about how people are going to diversify or new operations they're looking at setting up or benefits that they might gain. I kind of expected Hong Kong would have decades as being this important entry point to China and the Chinese market, and it really didn't. So I would say that Hong Kong, even from the time I started, right in 1997 when I became a lawyer, Hong Kong was this linchpin to China trade, and now it just doesn't come up that often anymore. So I don't know if it will diminish. I think that the future is not, the future doesn't seem super bright, which isn't to say that Hong Kong can't remain important and vital. It's just, it is not the linchpin that it was, right? It's not the place that you have to go if you want to get this done. So a few things. Doesn't really save your over-reliance problem on China. There are a lot of potential human rights and rule of law issues in the region, and we're going to talk about those in some detail as well. Those are very, very, very important future issues. Next slide, please. So how much diversification? There's a lot of movement out of China that we see, right? It's sort of every single day I have something on my desk that is dealing with issues that are related to leaving China. These are mostly driven by anti-dumping and countervailing duty, which is AD/CVD. And I'll just take a quick side note here to what those are. Anti-dumping is when things are sold essentially below the cost of production. There are a couple of other definitions, but that's sort of a big one. And the way that gets equalized is the US government puts a tariff on those things that is intended to equalize the markets, right? So if they are producing at a price that's 30% below what that fair price would be in the US, you add a 30% duty. The thing about AD/CVD is you can get absurdly high duties. Right now, there's mattresses from Vietnam case that has a 989% duty, which means if you import this, you will pay 10 times the value of the mattress in duties. I don't think that duty is going to stand up over time, but in the meantime, you need to be depositing 10 times the amount. You can imagine that people immediately stopped importing mattresses from Vietnam subject to a 900% duty. Immediately. So AD/CVD on China is super common. It's by far the most common country, by far. Like, it's not close. And duties in the 200% range are common. So companies want to move away from that. They want to just not even have to deal with it. I mean, it's manageable. We manage it often, and people are able to get an advantage of having like a 5% duty. But it takes work, and it takes having a good organization, being sort of really diligent. And a lot of people just say, I'm not going to do it. 232 duties and 301 duties are the 25% duties I've talked about. 232 is the steel and aluminum. 301 is sort of everything else from China. And, I think people have just seen news stories about these various rounds of the trade war. 232 and 301 are the trade war. But that, those 25% duties have caused people to just not want to deal with it anymore. There's a sense among a lot of people I deal with that 301 in particular is not going to go away. And the Chinese government has sort of pivoted from being accommodating to less accommodating. And they just don't see it becoming better anytime soon. We already talked about increased costs. So as labor rates go up and people move further and further into the country, they lose a bunch of the advantage of the low labor. And then there is a herd mentality. I've absolutely had people call me and say, how many of your clients are leaving China? And I say, it's happening. And they say, well, I don't know, should I be getting out? Well, I don't know, is your business working? Right? I mean, I think the sense that what other people are doing is what you should be investigating is very strong. And people don't want to have to tell their investors, yeah, everyone else did it, but I ignored it and it blew up in our face. So I think that's part of it as well. A couple of things with diversification. There's an enormous amount of third-party fraud because we talked about the sort of seamless creation of factories and vendors. So the most seamless way to do that is to just lie about it, right? You buy a building in Vietnam, you put a sign on the front of it that says Vietnam Hanger Factory. You ship hangers from China to Vietnam. You put them in the back door with a sign that says made in China. They go out the front door with a sign that says made in Vietnam. You ship them to the US. There you go. Vietnamese hangers. There's an enormous amount of that kind of fraud. And there are a set of cases called IEPA. And I know that EAPA does not equal IEPA, but it's how the Department of Justice insists on pronouncing it. So this is where we are. Customs has a whole page. If you go on the Customs webpage and search EAPA, they will bring up a whole page of allegations and cases that have been decided. And you'll see there's an enormous amount of fraud. So one of the things that diversifying parties need to be super careful of is not ending up in fraudulent transactions. Because the reality is, you don't have to participate in the fraud at any level. You don't have to be aware of it. There doesn't have to be any part of it that you're involved in. You as the importer are the only company that Customs has jurisdiction over. So you are going to bear the burden. You're going to bear the penalties. you're the one they're going to go after, because they can't get this overseas suppliers, but they can get you. So third-party fraud is a huge issue. And the other thing is, if all of your inputs are from China and you just assemble them in a third party, you assemble them in Vietnam or the Philippines and ship them to the US, it's possible that for US trade purposes, that's still a Chinese product. If that's still a Chinese product, you achieved nothing except you added the cost of shipping all that stuff to a third country. So diversification is really common, but it has a bunch of issues built into it that have to be dealt with. And this is what I'm spending an enormous amount of time on, is making sure that all of your Chinese product that gets shipped to the Philippines to be put together and shipped to the US is a Philippine product, not a Chinese product. Right? A Philippine product probably is duty-free because the Philippines is poor and there's some trade benefits to them. Chinese product has regular duties plus 25%. It's a huge difference if that's a product you're selling to consumers. Next slide, please. So, a couple of issues on the horizon. The Generalized System of Preferences is a trade program, and it's the one I just referenced with respect to the Philippines. It allows less developed countries and least developed countries, so basically poor countries, under certain very specific conditions to be able to access the US market duty-free. So your Philippine product that meet all of the conditions of GSP enter duty-free, whereas maybe your Chinese product has a 5, 6, 8% duty on it. So not only is labor cheaper, but you're also avoiding duties and some other customs formalities. It makes it a little more palatable to be in some of these poor countries. It is a program that the US unilaterally applies to these countries, right? There's no return benefit that the Philippines gives the US, and it has to be renewed periodically. And it is up for renewal as of December 31st, it'll expire. And with all of the politics that have been floating around, it looks very likely to expire. So some of the reasons it looks likely to expire is there are people who would like to tie it to the US unemployment rate. The US unemployment rate gets over a certain percent, we stop giving duty-free treatment to other countries. There are people who want to tie the human rights and rule of law observance to GSP. So if you have a bad human rights record, you can't get GSP. And that the human rights rule of law is really targeting the Philippines right now. They have a government that there are people who are very concerned about how the rule of law works in the Philippines at the moment. The tie to US unemployment is right now, so the human rights part is more from the Democratic side and the unemployment is a Republican thing. And I don't know if either or both are likely to end up in the ultimate bill. Maybe neither will, but it's an issue, and I don't think it'll get resolved by December 31st. So that could impact several countries in the region, certainly the Philippines, Indonesia, perhaps as well, and perhaps Malaysia. So two things, one's more of a statement than a question. This article in the New York Times about China trade booming. Yeah, China trade is absolutely booming with a lot of the things that are being purchased. The Amazon boom that we're all going through right now is largely a China boom because those are straight consumables. So, surging television imports, which is something we've been seeing. That's going to benefit China now and probably for a while, right? Televisions are relatively difficult to move the production of. So TVs and those sorts of things, as long as people are hunkering down for we're going to be in this pandemic and my TV is too small and I'm home all the time, which frankly we just did like a month ago, that sort of consumable is not leaving China in the near future. What we're talking about here is crankshafts and brake pads and steel sheet and steel roll and lots of the heavy stuff that moves elsewhere. Parts of things like lamps, lights, any LED elements that can be moved, any solar elements that can be moved, but none of these are the things that you're going to ever get on Amazon in order. So the way Amazon is booming right now is the way China is booming right now. And that's not going to go away, right? China is going to be an enormous, important economy before and after this. That's not going to change, right? I would argue that based on sort of the history of the world, China, India, Europe, North America, and probably somewhere in South America are always at some level on the upswing or downswing of being sort of, enormous, important cultural and economic places. And so that's not going to change anytime soon. That's a little different from what we're talking about, though. What are you hearing about reshoring for apparel manufacturing? So we don't tend to be very apparel driven, my firm. We tend to be more in things that are metal and similar. But I don't hear much about it. It seems what I do know about it, I feel like it is more of a diversification issue than a reshoring issue. I could be wrong about that, but I feel like through my industry, every couple of years, there's this wave of, you guys, everything's changing now because somebody's making jeans in Los Angeles, or they're going to make socks in South Carolina. And ultimately, the economics just catch up with them and they can't do it, right? And that's why you see Bangladesh and then Cambodia and like this sort of the t-shirt entry into world trade. I don't know if anybody listened to the podcast. I can't remember the name of it now. They did an entire piece about how, Korea entered global markets with t-shirts and then sort of graduated out of t-shirts. And if you track where t-shirts are made, it's where people are trying to get into global trade. So I don't see a lot of that. Maybe it's happening. I'm not aware of it. Oh, we're going to finish on time. I see there's 5 minutes left. Can we have the next slide, please? So the big horizon issue I see is forced labor enforcement. So articles that are made with forced or prison labor are ineligible to be admitted into the US. And this is a bipartisan issue. There is nobody in Congress who doesn't hate forced labor prison articles. Both sides of the aisle are strongly supportive of enforcement. And with some of what's been happening in China with respect to the Uyghur population, Northwest China has really become a hotbed for enforcement on this issue. So I have a tiny URL there for a background article. You should know Malaysia's had some issues, not a huge amount, but Malaysia's had issues. There have been issues in Africa, but overwhelmingly, this has been an issue in China. And people are having entry denied. Can we go to the next slide, please? So keep in mind a few things. And actually, I want to highlight this. there are due diligence steps that are in that linked article. That linked article is on my firm's webpage. We list a series of due diligence steps, but this is indirect supply as well as direct. So last week they issued a general withholding order for cotton from a company that is the dominant company in Northwest China. It's not that you can't import cotton from them. It's that you can't import cotton from them, and you can't import articles that use cotton from them. So your supply chain may just go back to the t-shirt company, right? If their supply chain goes back to Northwest China, you can't import that article. And ultimately, if customs has a suspicion that that's their supply chain and it's where you're importing from, the burden will be on you to prove that your supply chain does not include banned prison or forced labor articles. So having those burdens rest on you is a nightmare. It's very, very difficult, in part because often your vendors don't want to share that info, right? They don't want you to know where they get their materials. It's also a tremendous PR nightmare, right? Having anyone get hold of the knowledge that your company has had products banned from being imported into the US because they're using forced and prison labor is a terrible look, right? Nobody wants to have to say, hold on, this is really nuanced and actually it's our supplier's supplier. It doesn't really help. So we've seen this in some electronics imports. We're seeing it in cotton right now. But if you go to that article, it will take you to the link at the customs page that lists all of the enforcement actions, and they're coming fast and furious. There's legislation kicking around in Congress to just bar any imports of articles made with products that come out of Northwest China, because the suspicion is Northwest China is not a business-friendly region, so to speak. It is largely populated with Uyghurs, and most of the big business there is out of camps that Uyghurs have been put in to be taught, re-educated. I won't get into the underlying issues there, but they are generally tied to some of China's actions with regard to the Uyghurs. And that is what's driving the findings. So you're going to want to be very, very, very careful with this issue. And this is a huge China issue that everyone supports, so it's not going to go away. Go to the next slide. I already said most of this. I think that there'll still be confrontation with China. It might be a little different. I expect fewer trade conflicts with allies, particularly, the Germanys of the world, and then some of the countries in Asia. And I would expect that the US would go back to exploring deeper trade relationships like we were targeted to have with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and pulled out of. I don't think we can just jump back in, but I suspect that a trade NATO to try to hem China in is something more in keeping with what they're likely to do than not. Next slide, please. If you've heard any banging around, that's her right there. It's all her fault. We took her out of the room so she wouldn't bother me while I did this, and I hear her crashing against the walls and everything else. So she might as well have sat in here.
Thank you so much, David. That's fantastic. Always very informative, your presentations, and I have to say that is very similar to Tim's situation. We quite often get the occasional bark from Tim's dog as well, so we're well used to that. She was very quiet.
She didn't mean
if you want to hear. If you want to hear more from David, as he mentioned, and as Tim mentioned, he will be doing CCIT for us again in April. So it's always a great course. It is the most difficult one, I will admit. We hear that frequently, but also one that people really enjoy, and they gain such an amount of information from it. So thanks again, David. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and great
Thank
presentation. And we will send out some information on. Don't worry about those links and the URL and all of that. We will send all of that to you, as I said, hopefully by end of day, certainly by end of day tomorrow. So just remains for me to thank you all so much for joining us, and we wish you happy, safe holidays, and we look forward to seeing you in 2021 for what we hope is a inoculated, vaccine-laden new year where we can all once again gather in person. So please keep an eye on your inboxes for future events. We're planning for the next quarter as we speak, and just want to make sure that you don't miss any of those in January. So have a great one and see you all in 2021. Thanks again. Thanks.